This episode of Louisiana Legends is dedicated to the memory of Joshua Logan.
Major funding for this production is provided by Arco Oil and Gas Company. Additional funding provided by Friends of LPB.
Critic John Mason Brown said of him, "He is a master of his medium. He is able to cast a spell over playgoers, which persuades them that all clocks, except those behind the footlights, have been halted. He possesses the magician's wand." And fellow Louisianians, tonight, a great Louisianian and surely the magician of the American theater, Joshua Logan. Josh, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be back in Louisiana.
What about those early years in Mansfield? What was it like growing up?
Well, it was wonderful. The no ice cream man came with good humors in the afternoon, but the hot tamale man came by every afternoon to our little terrace there in my grandfather's house. I was brought up by my grandfather and grandmother because my father died when I was just 2 years old.
Yes, sir. And your grandfather, John McHenry Neighbors, this struck me, recited Shakespeare.
Oh, yes. There was always something artistic about our home. My grandmother painted china, and she played the piano and sang duets with Aunt Jenny, her sister, who was from Waco. And my grandfather toured the United States a great deal, selling shoes, I think, for a while. That's when he had bad years with the plantation. He had 2 plantations, but they didn't always pay off. And my mother, she was very, very much of a poet. She only believed in writing as an important thing in the world, you know. Recently, she said to me, not too long ago, it was maybe 15 or 20 years ago, she said, "Josh, why don't you write?" And I said, "Mother, I just won the Pulitzer Prize for South Pacific." And she said, "Oh, that." She couldn't believe that writing plays was anything serious, you know.
What was your earliest memory of becoming interested in this peculiar world of putting on plays and the theater?
I really don't know. I don't know how I got into the theatrical side of life. I loved showing off as a kid, I think, you know. I remember that I used to perform in front of all my sister and little cousins' dolls. I'd put them all around, and I'd get up and perform. And I used to dress up my little baby cousins, and I'd climb the pecan tree as the... Well, Mother, you know, believed in... she didn't believe in Mother Goose. She believed in Shakespeare. So first thing I learned was, "Hark, hark, the lark, at heaven's gates arise, and feebler skins to ope his golden eyes," or something like that. And, you know, it would make my grandfather and my uncles kind of sick at their stomach when they'd hear me talk like that. But that's the way I was brought up, and that's the way I heard. I must say, it must have done something to me because I do remember it.
Your mother remarried a member of the faculty at Culver Military Academy at Biloxi, Mississippi.
Yes.
And you attended Culver. Now, what your many friends and admirers don't know about Joshua Logan at Culver Military Academy is that you also boxed at the academy.
Well, yes, I boxed. You had to join some athletic event all year long, you know, and so boxing was something that took place through the winter. And I was no good at basketball. I just couldn't do it. That's all there was to it. And so I boxed instead. But of course I boxed. The thing about my boxing was that I grew up to have a man's body very early. When I was 13, I was really taller than I am now because I've shrunk a bit. But I used to go into the fight, you know, and I was so scared that I went into a complete blank, you know, and I would fight and I'd win and they'd hold up my hand, you know, and I would not be happy at all because I thought, oh, that means I got to keep on.
And what lured you then to Princeton?
Well, the Triangle Club did. I didn't go to Princeton. I went to the Triangle Club. The Triangle Club is an off-campus, not off-campus, but extracurricular activity of Princeton. There was none at that time, any kind of drama course at Princeton. I didn't go to Princeton because it was a famous drama place.
I see.
I went because I saw pictures of boys that were traveling the United States with this show, this musical show that they did every year. It was started by Booth Tarkington many, many years ago, 1890, I believe. And every year they put on this musical play. They still do it, only now it has girls in it, and it's better than it used to be, and so therefore it's not as good. You know,
May I share with our audience that your fellow students voted you not only the most original award, but the man who thinks he's the most original. I thought that was wonderful.
It was I got 2 awards.
Yes.
Thinks he's most original, and thinks he's wittiest and wittiest. I don't know how they ever got the word witty in there.
You lived up to all
witty.
of your expectations. Now, there were some other people who were destined to become legends who participated in those theatrical productions. Jimmy Stewart?
Well, the first year I was there, I wasn't allowed to be in the Triangle Club because freshmen weren't allowed in those days. So I joined the theater and team, which was the dramatic school. And I tried out for the first play of the year. It was called Open Collars by a man who's become my good friend, Eric Barno. It was directed by Bertain Windus, who later became a good friend too. And in that cast was that I joined, and I was chosen because I heard that they wanted somebody who could laugh, and I laughed up a storm, you know, and got into it. And there was a boy in that cast called Myron McCormick, who was just marvelous, and he was a sophomore, and he and I got to be good friends too. Later on, I wrote a part for him in South Pacific, Billis. The thing I remember about him most of all was he could do a stomach dance, because when we did the Triangle Club, we'd come back in the fall, or rather in the spring, to the old graduates when they come back for the graduation ceremonies, and we'd do our Triangle show again for them. And then we'd go to all the beer parties. That is, they had tents. Each class had a tent, and they had beer barrels. And Myron would do this stomach dance outside, and they'd invite us in, and that's the way I got the chance to drink beer in those days.
Then you did something that was almost unheard of for an American in those days. You went to Russia to observe the great Russian theatrical director, Stanislavski.
Well, not to observe, to study with him. I sat next to him while he directed opera, The Coq d'Or by Rimsky-Korsakov. I was very fortunate. Imagine a boy from Mansfield, Louisiana, getting to Russia when I was 19 years old. I was, you know, watching this man direct the Moscow Art Theater, which is the great theater of all time, you know, in its day, the greatest theater in the world. It changed the classic theater which we had in those days, where the people kind of were very stiff and orated their performances, come down to the footlights and do purple passages. But Stanislavski eliminated all that and brought the real theater to the public, and he was the beginning of that. And I studied with him. I got to know him, and I watched him daily directing the Russians. Of course, I didn't speak Russian, but he spoke French, and I spoke a little bit. And my friend who was with me, Charles Leatherby, spoke it fluently. So we got along very well.
What was your first New York directing job?
Well, I was a stage manager. I was trying to get along. Actually, there was a time when I'd left the University Players, which was the organization we had that played in summer theater. Myron McCormick, James Stewart, Henry Fonda, Margaret Sullivan, all were in that organization. And we did shows in the summertime up in Cape Cod, in Falmouth, and 2 years we went to Baltimore, Maryland in the wintertime. So I really got early experience in professional theater right after my freshman year at Princeton. I went up there to Cape Cod. And so I lived with Fonda Stewart and a boy named Myron McCormick. We took a place, well, it was a terrible place, I must tell you. We didn't cost very much, and that was very important because we didn't have any money. But it was through that I got to know a man named Jack Del Bondio, and he wanted to produce. So we produced a play on Broadway for $2,000. I don't know how it was possible. It was kind of, I think, a little bit under the carpet, you know, and under the table, because we closed the show where I was stage manager in the Ethel Barrymore Theater, and 3 weeks later opened another show with the same set, only we moved around and painted it up a little bit, and we kept the lights all hanging there so we didn't have to pay the electricians to do that, and doing no cartage, no trucks or anything like that. You couldn't do that today, you see. And the actors all played for a percentage, which meant nothing, of course.
What was your first?
That was the first play that I ever directed was in 1935, a few years after I left Princeton in 1931. That was called To See Ourselves. Then I went to California, and I was a dialogue director for The Garden of Allah.
Charles Boyer.
Charles Boyer, Marlene Dietrich, and I was the Englishman. I was the one who taught them English. And after that, because I had been a big shot in Hollywood, that is, I got $300 a week, which was an awful lot of money for me, having only got $25 a week before that. And when I came back, they offered me for the first time, a play that had not been refused by George Abbott and George S. Kaufman and all of the great directors. It was called On Borrowed Time, and it was in 1938. I was 28 years old, and
you had a hit.
Had a hit. It was a big smash hit.
Then you followed with I Married an Angel and
that was another huge
Holiday.
Hit. Both of those were big hits.
You know, I think that September Song is just about the loveliest melody that I've ever heard.
It was a wonderful song. It was a wonderful song. When I first got that offer to do Knickerbocker Holiday, they wanted Walter Houston to play the lead, the sort of villainous, heroic lead, Peter Stuyvesant. He was really a kind of a takeoff on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because Maxwell Anderson was trying to say that he was a kind of a dictator, and he was supposed to be that way. At any rate, I went out to see Walter Houston, and he said, I'll play it if I can have a song where I can be charming, where the old son of a gun can be charming to this young girl, even though she's younger than he. And if I have that, I'll play it. I said, well, you've got it. They'll write it for you. He said, no, I want to hear it. I got to hear it. Well, I had sung him the chorus. And now my voice is not a great voice. I mean, it's what we call in the business a composer's voice. Maybe this was a director's voice. At any rate, I'd sung the score for him, but he said he wanted to hear this other song, this love song. So I went back home, told Kurt Weill and Maxwell Anderson what he'd said. They went off for 2 hours and came back with a September Song.
Goodness sakes.
And we called it, we telephoned it long distance to Walter Houston. Kurt Weill first sang it to him with this thick German accent, you know, and Walter Houston couldn't tell much about it because he was trying to sell it, and he was more Germanic than usual. So he said, let Josh sing it. Well, he's got a lousy voice, but at least I can understand his lyrics. So I sang the September Song to Walter, and then he played it again. He said, play it again, and he sang it.
Goodness.
And he knew it, and he did, and because of that, he did the show.
Sir, you directed the fabulously successful Charlie's Aunt, which I suspect will run way beyond. I think when television is obsolete, Charlie's Aunt will still be being produced someplace.
Charlie's Aunt has earned for the Brandon Thomas family, now, since 1892, when it was written, at over £100,000 a year every year, and of course many more years than that, I don't know how many times it's been done. I think it's done almost every night somewhere in the world.
It's just like Puccini's opera. Something is it's always being done.
Always on the boards. It's the funniest. Of course, it's a battleship of construction. It's a great piece of playwriting as far as farce goes. Everybody thinks farce is sort of thrown away, but Charlie's Aunt is a mountain of power.
I think that a little later on in the 40s, something happened to Joshua Logan that I think put the seal on your being a great man. I think that as great as your contributions are to the theater, and you're the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and every other award that the theater can, or that literature can award, I think the manner in which you handled your emotional problems has meant more to people out there than anything that anyone has ever put on the stage. And by that I mean that you said, hey, it's okay to have those problems and for people to know, and here's a possible solution. I think that that's a monumental thing that you've done there.
I didn't do it to be heroic or noble or anything like that. I simply did it because it was a fact, you know. And I suddenly realized that I was a manic depressive. That was my disease. And I got so high when I was directing Charlie's Aunt that I had to go into a hospital right after that. And then I went into the Army, and I was in that for 4 years, so that calmed me down a little bit. But I was high, and I was low, but not as low as I was high. And I realized that you can get over that. I said to the doctor when I was in the hospital, I said, how will they know I'm all right? How will they ever trust me in the theater again after I've had this manic condition? Elation, we called it in those days. It was manic today. And he said, well, they'll just look at you and they'll say you're all right. And that's really what happened. After 3 months in the hospital, I was all right again. And since then, they've developed all kinds of cures for such a disease, and I take one called lithium. I take a little lithium, but I will always be a manic depressive. Always. I'll never get over that. So I'll always have to know that.
I think again the remarkable thing is the comfort that that your life in that area must give a whole lot of people, and not just theater goers, who say that you know, I or someone in my family may have these emotional problems. And Josh Logan had them and has them and has gone public with it, so it's okay. And he's this great success, so maybe I've got a chance in this arena of life.
Well, that's been the case many times. People have come to me very much the way you just described it and thanked me for writing the book. I didn't write it for that reason, but it somehow gave a plot to my story. And by getting over it and being able to live through it, I think it gave courage to a lot of people who thought it was the end of their lives, as I thought it was the end of my life when it happened to me. You
went in the service, and of course you were an experienced director, and so you directed This Is the Army, the Irving Berlin show.
I was called into that at the last minute. I got into the Army 9 days before it opened, but I went in and worked.
You didn't stay in the theatrical side of the Army,
I wanted to be in the war, the way, you know, people get into the Army and they fight the war, and I wanted to be part of the combat. And so I got Irving Berlin to let me out of This Is the Army, and I went into to Officer Candidate School and then later into Army Intelligence School, and I was in the Air Force.
You were a captain, overseas.
Yes, overseas. And finally, at the end of the war, they found out about my theatrical background. I always kept it quiet because I didn't want to have to do things in the Army camps with generals and generals' wives and all those, you know, people that critics. I don't like censorship of any sort.
Sir, then when you came out of the service, you returned to New York and you directed Irving Berlin's greatest hit, Annie, Get Your Gun, with Ethel Merman.
Yes, that was probably the biggest run, the longest run I ever had in anything. Well, it was the Annie, Get Your Gun, and I really enjoyed doing that enormously, and that, of course, reestablished me on Broadway. Then
you wrote a play. You won a Pulitzer Prize, and theatrical history was made.
South Pacific.
South Pacific. How did that come into?
Well, I had written Mr. Roberts before that. I fell in love with that book by Tom Hagen. To me, it showed exactly what happens to the man in the service, whether it was the Air Force or the Navy or the Army. The boredom of life in the service is something that was hard to live through. And there was always some captain or some sergeant or somebody in charge of you that could say, you got to do this or you can't do that. And all of that was embodied in this wonderful book by Thomas Hagen called Mr. Roberts, and it sold several million copies. It's one of the great books of the Second World War. We made a play of it, he and I, and it was the best thing I think I ever did in my life. Mr. Roberts was a great play in itself because of what Thomas Hagen's book said. And fortunately, I had worked with Maxwell Anderson and some other playwrights, so I knew what to do about putting it together as a play. And then I did the same thing with Oscar Hammerstein on South Pacific. And I remember that I just knew it was going to win the Pulitzer Prize before it opened. I just knew that. And so I insisted that we keep everything in it that we liked in it because I had a feeling that was what was going to win the prize. If we had cut out all the things they suggested we cut out in Boston, like You've Got to Be Taught to Hate and Fear, that famous song of Cable's, it would not have won the prize, I'm sure.
And then you weren't through yet. Then you did that incredible production of Picnic, didn't you?
Picnic,
which
yes.
also won every prize.
But before that, I did my Louisiana play. You didn't bring that up. The Wisteria Trees. Helen Hayes, whom I had directed in Happy Birthday, came to our house one time, and I remembered seeing her as Norma Besant in Coquette, and of course, being a Southerner, I had a thick Southern accent, and her accent was impeccable. She'd been brought up in Washington and was close to Southern. So when she said she was going to do the Cherry Orchard the next year, I thought, what can Helen Hayes do? Why should she have to do the Cherry Orchard when she has this fabulous Southern background? So I suddenly thought of changing the Cherry Orchard and making it into a Louisiana play. And I called it the Wisteria Trees because I remember the way the wisteria used to grow around our place in Mansfield. And I remembered all my childhood and all the language that everybody spoke in those days. I remembered the word correctly, for instance. I reckon I can do this, and things that words came to me and through memory, and I transplanted the play, The Cherry Orchard, to Louisiana, to one of the great homes there, and called it the Wisteria Trees, and that became a very important part of my life. I toured Louisiana looking at all of the beautiful old homes, thank goodness. I went to Avery Island and met Mr. McElhenney. Came to Miss Cammie Henry, who lived in Natchitoches, and met Lyle Saxon and Rourke Bradford and all the great Louisiana writers. And I really got back into Louisiana lore again.
You love this state, don't you?
I do. I'm very proud of this state. I think it's the most original state in the United States.
We're pretty proud of Joshua Logan.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Now, you had, folks, when the World Series comes along, if somebody gets up and in one World Series games hits 3 home runs, it is a miraculous event. This man whom I'm interviewing this evening hit 3 home runs in the World Series. That is, he had 3 hit shows running at the same time on Broadway. That's astonishing.
I had 4.
4?
Yeah, I had 4 at one point. It only lasted a couple of weeks because one was dwindling out as another one opened. But it is very seldom that you can have that happen to you, I must admit that. But you see, Annie Get Your Gun ran such a long time that it overlapped.
South Pacific Picnic.
South Pacific Picnic. And
Wish You Were Here.
Wish You Were Here, yes. Wish You Were Here was a play I did, which I loved very much. Harold Rome is a marvelous writer of music and lyrics. He did Wish You Were Here, and I did with him again Fanny, the wonderful Pagnol story.
Because of the limitations of time, what brings native son Joshua Logan back to? We're taping this program tonight in Shreveport. But you're operating this summer out of Natchitoches, Louisiana.
Natchitoches, Louisiana.
What is Broadway doing in Natchitoches? A fabulous, lovely city. But
well, I was called down there by a great man named Mr. Alice, you know, Professor Alice, who has started this wonderful school called the Louisiana School, which is for very bright young students, gifted students. The top two, it's a high school, and it's just a top two thing. I made a lecture there, and I saw this glorious theater, the Loda Theater there, this outdoor theater. And I wanted to work in it. I thought, oh, that wonderful theater, I've got to work in it. And I said, do you think I could ever find a boy to play Huck Finn here? And Alice said, I'll find you one. I'll search Louisiana and find you one. So that's what's happened. I've agreed to come. We've rewritten the play. I tried it out last fall in Florida, where I was teaching at the Florida Atlantic University. And now it's a completely rewritten thing that I'm doing in Louisiana. We're trying it out at the Loda Theater, which is the theater outside of Natchitoches, for the month of July up to August 4th. And it may go to the World's Fair for a couple of days. I'm not sure of that. But I eventually am going to tour it all over until it's absolutely right. And then we're going to open either off or on Broadway, depending on what is right for it.
Well, we wish you well in your endeavor.
Thank you. I'm crazy, but it's called Huck and Jim, with a sort of a subtitle, On the Mississippi. But Huck and Jim is the title. And it's based on Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. It is a story. It's a grown-up story, though. It's not the story of Tom Sawyer, which is a boy's story. It's Huck and his older man, Negro slave, runaway, Jim, as they float down the raft on the Mississippi. It's a fabulous story. It's one of the great new American classic writings. Ernest Hemingway gives it credit as being the greatest thing ever written in America, but we don't know that.
Well, the time has fled us, and I know that I speak on behalf of all theatergoers for thanking you, Joshua Logan, for the magic that you've brought into all of our lives. And I also thank you for the people who've had mental and emotional problems, to whom you've given comfort and a feeling that life is not over. And thank you so very much for joining us tonight on Louisiana Legends. You're one of
Major funding for this production is provided by Arco Oil and Gas Company. Additional funding provided by Friends of LPB.